What's up everybody, this is AJ from Alpha Pixel, and today I am super excited to share with you my new plugin, Gaussian Splat Studio. This plugin allows you to import, edit, and also export Gaussian splats natively in Cinema 4D with Cinema 4D's standard render, Viewport Render, and Redshift Render. For those of you not familiar with Gaussian splatting, it's basically a scan of a real-world scene using something like your phone or camera that you would then upload to a service like Polycam, and that will then reconstruct your scene in 3D using tiny little splat points that are very efficient for 3D programs to render versus standard geometry. And Gaussian Splat Studio will take those PLY files that it creates and let you import them and manipulate them with Cinema 4D's standard MoGraph editing tools like Effectors and simulation forces and field. So without further ado, let's get right into it. These splat scenes will vary a lot. Some of them are very heavy. For example, here we have a scene with 12 million points, which is quite a bit. But we have options within the plugin to speed up heavy scenes like this. But to demonstrate the plugin, I'd like to start with something a little simpler using a file with a more average splat size. So we're going to load up our tractor scene here, and you'll see that it actually imported over here. Like I said, the scaling of these is kind of wildly different from scene to scene. You can see it comes in looking nice and sharp, and you'll notice that as I'm navigating here, it kind of degrades the quality. That's just to speed up viewport as you're navigating around. You can always turn that off. That's just the interactive splat reduction here. It just helps speed things along. As I mentioned before, we have a few different ways to kind of speed things up, so that's just one of them. So in bringing a splat in, you'll just load your file here. You can kind of set the world scale, and some splats, like I said, come in a little differently. Typical Gaussian splat will come in fine. Sometimes if it's a regular splat file, which is different than a Gaussian splat file, both a PLY file, but those regular splat files will come in on the wrong axis, so you may need to flip the YZ direction on those. And we do have a few different modes of viewing these splats. So we have our traditional splat here in the viewport, and we also have point cloud mode if you'd rather render perfectly circular dots. Gaussian splats are actually not perfectly circular. They kind of adapt their shape to fill the spaces more efficiently, which is why you'll see some bigger than others. And then we have the proxy geometry, which is more there just to kind of see what's going on under the hood. Most of the time, I imagine you'll be using the Gaussian splat mode here. So once you have your scene imported, you may need to adjust the splat size, which is the overall splat size. If it comes in looking, you know, kind of like this with some holes and gaps, you may need to increase the splat size. But if it comes in looking too puffy like a cloud, you may need to reduce the splat size, but it should adapt most splats to look okay. You might need some small tweaks, which is why we have these settings here. We also have two other important parameters here, the minimum pixel radius and the maximum pixel radius. So basically the minimum pixel radius, you can see as I'm kind of do new viewport navigation here, you can see some bigger splats and smaller splats. Minimum pixel radius is adjusting the size of those smaller splats, and max is adjusting the size of the big splats. So the the smaller splats are responsible for more of the details in the splat, and the bigger pixels, or the max pixels, are more responsible for filling in larger areas. So if we were to reduce this, you kind of look at the glass here, you'll see the glass kind of fading away. That's kind of an area where it would need more larger splats. So if we reduce that too much, you'll see kind of a hole in that area. So just leave it at 4. You can kind of get that glass tint look there. Also, just note, it will not render when you do your final renders. It will not render with this intermediate splat reduction. That's just for viewport navigation, that is. So we would actually render this splat here out of the viewport. We can also render in standard render modes and Redshift render modes, but the viewport does give a little bit more accuracy. So native viewport rendering does not allow alpha channels. So we do have a checkbox here to quick flip it into an alpha channel mode. And you'll see that it's not a perfectly white image, and that's fine because it actually does need that semi-transparent / gray area to composite with, and it will look more accurate. But of course, in your compositing program, you can also use a levels or something to dial up the gray into a full white if you needed it. So you can just uncheck that to get out of it. And then we also do have some other settings down here that you really shouldn't need to touch, but they are there if you do need finer control. And then as I mentioned before, there are a few ways to speed up the viewport. The viewport is already pretty fast with this interactive splat reduction, but if you had a heavier scene, we do have a fast preview mode, and this is here just so that you don't have to mess with your original settings. You can just kind of create your own little preview setting here. So if I click that, it automatically goes into point cloud mode, when we can have it still set to Gaussian Splat, just a reduced amount. But point cloud, I feel like gets the point across very well. You just increase the size a little bit so we can kind of get a better idea. Now this is extremely fast, very fluid playback. Maybe we don't need to go quite so much on this particular model, but it does let you preview. And even when you're doing things like simulations and effectors with this, preview mode is very helpful. So really quick too, I want to show you some of the rendering modes. If you twirl down the render appearance, we're going to have enable rendering, and that's not on by default just because it has to build some things in the background, and it actually does make the system just a little bit slower when using it. And actually, I do just want to back up for one quick second as we look in at the rendering for the viewport mode right before we get into the render appearance here. So I want to pull up the render settings, and if we were in viewport mode, viewport render, this is where you would render out of the viewport. And then you can adjust what you want to see for quality here. And then in your filter, you'll likely just check geometry only so you can get rid of all the other lines there. And then use alpha mode to create a alpha channel. But back in basic, you may also want to up the anti-aliasing a little bit and the super sampling a little bit if rendering out of the viewport. And I did want to quick mention that because in render appearance, if we were to go ahead and enable rendering while we're in viewport render, it actually tells you here it's unsupported because our render appearance mode will only work with standard render and Redshift render currently. So if we were to try and enable it, you're going to get a little pop-up saying that this renderer is not supported. So you'll see if I switch to something like Redshift, now it recognizes that. So we're going to go ahead and enable rendering. So like I said, it's going to do a little thing in the background. You probably won't even notice it most of the time, but it also created a shader for us for that geometry that it built in the background. Now, one thing to note, what we're seeing in the viewport is not what Redshift is going to render. And if you do want to check that out, you can go up to Redshift and render Redshift view, and then just hit the preview button here. And the view is almost identical, as you'll see here. And we do get a lot of the same parameters in the render appearance that we do up in the viewport appearance. The splat size and minimum maximum pixel radius. The one new property we have is relight blending, which will allow us to use Redshift's native lighting. So you'll see at 0, it's basically fully luminescent and it's just baked in. It's just showing us the baked in lighting from the splat. But if we go ahead and dial this up to 1, you'll see our render kind of change a little bit. It's not going to change too much because we don't have a light in the scene. So if we go ahead and add an area light, you're going to see already something's happening. So if we go ahead and pull this up, we can kind of see over in the preview window there, it kind of being more interactive. So let's make it a little bigger and just kind of pull it up here. Make it so we can see a little better there. All right, so yeah, if we move the light around, you're going to see that we actually do get some interactive lighting on our model there. And of course, you can dial the blend up and down if you want to bring back some of that natural splat lighting, just kind of combine them. That's the way to do it. And all the same stuff works with the Cinema 4D standard render as well. One thing I do need to just cut in really quick here is that if you are in render appearance mode, if you are adjusting something like the splat density and your render ends up looking like this, all you need to do is come over here to refresh shader. Since the point count changed, it just needs to kind of rebuild that back end to adjust for that new point count. So just note that if you ever see your render popping up looking very off, just go ahead and refresh the shader. It should just take a quick second and it will be back to looking normal again. I just want to keep moving on here so we can show you the rest of the features. We're going to go ahead and show you some of the forces and effectors. So I'm gonna close this out here, and I could just load a new splat, but I'd rather just delete everything and just add a new splat object here. And I'm gonna go ahead and open our bonsai scene. Fun one to work with here. Kind of shows you all the little details you can get out of a splat as well. It's very nice. So the way you would add effectors and forces into these splats is the same as you would most objects. If you have it selected and you add a effector or force, it's going to add it right into our effectors or forces field tabs right down here. If you didn't, you just have to drag them in. So just double check if nothing's working that you have them loaded properly. So I'm going to go ahead and add a plane effector. You'll notice it jumped up and turned white. That's because it does use color mode by default. So if we want color back, we just turn that off. And it jumped up because we have our position at 100. If we go ahead and add a linear field in there, you'll see kind of the effect. And of course, we can rotate that around. And if we were to actually turn that color mode back on, you can see it kind of blends very nicely right there. Can add for some cool effects. You'll see playback performance is pretty good too. It didn't take much of a hit at all. So then if we go ahead and do something like take the scale, and if we go -1, one thing to note too is if a splat particle reaches 0 scale, essentially being invisible, it will not be rendered. So it does actually speed up your system, which is nice. So if I go ahead and move that around, we're going to see that happen, this little effect happen here. Let's go ahead and turn off the position, and then let's add a random effector because that's always fun. Where are we at? Random effector. And I'm going to go ahead and limit that random effector with our linear field. So now we're sort of getting this disintegration effect here. Or build on effect if you were to do it in reverse, which is kind of fun. It's just a lot of fun to play with this. So now that we've looked at how to add effectors, we can go ahead and add some forces in. I'm just gonna go ahead and zero this out because we might use this. We might reuse this effector. So I'm just gonna go ahead and disable those. And then I'm gonna go ahead and select my splat and add a wind force. Actually, I'll bring the forces down here and add a wind force. You'll see it moved a little bit right there. So, and again, this linear field is not currently doing anything with the force we have here. So let's go ahead and hit play on that. And you'll see it starts to move. Let's add a little turbulence in there. And turn the scale down so it actually has a little more detail to it. The interesting thing you'll notice, if it's behaving a little differently than it would with, say, particles, because I'm able to interactively see the changes in real time, and that's because by default these forces apply linearly, meaning it's not a real simulation, it's just doing math to calculate what the wind force is doing. It's not reacting to anything else. And of course, we can turn that on. What you're normally used to with particles would be this real force simulation. So it's actually going to calculate and react to different things. But what's fun here is that we can, of course, add in our field to this as well and enable the field so that we only get the effect on a certain portion of it there. And if we turn our turbulence scale down even more, of course it starts looking pretty dang cool. And again, I can interactively adjust this while I'm kind of in our default linear mode here. So, and playback is pretty good, but it can be better. Of course, I told you before that we could use fast preview mode. So if I turn that on and increase the splat size a little bit, we'll get much smoother playback. Pretty cool. So let's actually just increase the time here a little bit, give us a little more simulation time. And again, we can fully interactively kind of mess with this now. Super cool. Now, again, if you did want the real force simulation, just go down here in the forces tab here and just check that on. So now we're going to get it interacting like you would normally expect with particles. So if I hit play, you'll see I can just touch a little portion of that and back it off, and it's just going to keep going. And I can slowly bring that back in, and our particles are moving. Very cool. Just try real quick turning it on. Oh, and grab the, turn it on its head here. Start it over. Of course, we could set the wind to go up if we wanted to. I'm just not grabbing the right axis here. Kind of fun. Super cool way to disintegrate objects. And of course we can turn on the regular splat as well. Just uncheck that and we get our splat preview here, or our splat render here. So that is forces and effectors. One other quick thing I'll mention is that we'll take our plane effector here and turn it on, and let's add a box field to it. Let's say we wanted to just get rid of this wood platform and leave only the plant portion. Right now that is not happening, so we can just move this down and maybe make it a little thinner. And we'll decrease the remap a little bit here, the offset. And we can also, well, we shouldn't really see the green, but we can just turn that off in our effector as well, just so to make sure that we don't see any of that. So again, like I mentioned before, you can edit your splats, and now you can also export that splat edited, and those splat points and the wood platform will not be there if you were to export right now, because as I mentioned, if the splat goes to 0, it's just completely gone. So this will allow us to edit our splats if we want. And that is the basics of our Gaussian Splat Studio. It's super fun to play around with, and I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with and how you're using this. Super nice to be able to have Gaussian splatting native in Cinema 4D and be able to work with it in this way. I did want to mention as well that if you have any questions on any of these parameters, you can always reference the help doc down here, and it will bring you to a page that gives a little description on any of those. But beyond that, if you have any questions, of course, you can always reach out at alphapixel.net on our contact page. We have some other plugins in the works, so keep an eye out for those. Sign up to the newsletter for the latest info on all of that. As always, I really appreciate your support, and we will see you guys in the next video.